Today it's my pleasure to introduce our very first Australian dyslexic tutor, Jacquline Caskey. Jacqueline recently completed her PhD in sociology, focusing on dyslexia and learning difficulties, with a particular interest in working with students in higher education and in the workplace. She has a background in teaching and currently tutors young people and adults who have dyslexia on the Sunshine Coast. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Jacque.
Well, thanks for having me, Shay. It's a real pleasure to speak to your dear dyslexic listeners, because I find that this is the way to get our message out.
So how did you get involved with working with young people and adults that have dyslexia?
Well, Shay, first of all, I was a nurse in hospitals, and that's where I learned to treat each patient with their difficulties. And of course, as you know, each patient would have been unique, not unlike our students and people with dyslexia. And I always had lovely relationships with my patients, and I learned to respect and service their individual needs in the wards and as a patient needing support. However, I then went to university and enrolled in a teaching program. And again, here I was helping people with difficulties to learn and find their feet in high schools and later on in TAFE. On completion of my Masters of Education, I worked with adults in vocational education providers in Queensland. And I worked as a disability officer and with people who have a range of disabilities, all requiring reasonable adjustments and the individual support within the educational sectors. I found that as a disability officer, students' needs were not exactly or empirically supported due to the lack of knowledge around the disability and within the teaching profession in Queensland. In the early days, for teachers, there was no inclusion courses and very little known about disability.
So when you talk about reasonable adjustments, what were what supports were you giving those students at the time?
Well, it was interesting because they varied. Some people who had vision impairment used JAWS, which is a technology that all people with vision impairment use, and it was fabulous for students who were either blind or vision impaired. Then I used Dragon, naturally speaking, another technology for people with learning disabilities and dyslexia. But the reasonable adjustments ranged from technology right through to writing their work out, double spacing, different coloured papers. I often sent students to be checked for Erlen lenses when they came up with various symptoms. And then I'd often do one-on-one tutoring and assignment writing using various strategies for their individual needs. But the strategies were so comprehensive. I used mind mapping. I would ask them to plan their chapters in sections. And I wrote notes for them and told them to use mapping books for their notes. And of course, this went on into using spreadsheeting to make sure that the topics of their assignments and their lectures written out because in those early days there were no lecture notes given. So they may have a writer who would go in, or a scribe as we call them, who would go in and write the lecture notes out and then give them to the student, and they would put them through Dragon as an audio file and listen to the lecture. So they're only just a few of the reasonable adjustments. They are very extensive and dependent upon the student's needs, of course.
Well, it's really exciting that we've got people like you out there now, Jackie, because we've on previous shows we talked about the fact that we haven't really got dyslexic tutors and people supporting people with dyslexia in TAFE and universities. So to have people that can actually talk about reasonable adjustments in that space is just amazing. So how did you end up focusing on people with specific learning disabilities? What was your driving factor in focusing your area and your PhD in that?
Well, it was interesting because I completed my PhD in dyslexia because there was very little known about it in Queensland. And we were all getting diagnoses of learning disabilities or learning difficulties. And there was a real difference between the three of them because there were learning disabilities in those days. Autism was covered under the learning disability before it became a unique disability. Dyslexia was covered under it. Speech-language impairment was covered under it. There were, ADHD was covered under that learning disability. And I found that when we were looking at people with specific disabilities, teachers didn't have that understanding of what support was related to this disability or that disability because there hadn't been anything written up at that stage. And in Queensland, it wasn't until 2010 that a booklet of reasonable adjustments was implemented for teachers teaching in the field. But I don't believe that the teachers, to be honest with you, like teachers everywhere, their workload is so demanding. They didn't have time to be implementing all of these strategies for one particular student when they might have 8 to 10 of them with different disabilities in their classrooms, particularly within the TAFE sector. And I think teachers lacked the knowledge because they didn't have time to actually take that knowledge on. And of course, as you know, Shay, we are all searching for, we're promoting that a course of professional development be delivered to people, to teachers and people working with students who have dyslexia.
And it's really interesting that you say that there were the three areas where autism was being labelled as one and dyslexia and then your specific speech and language disorders and your ADHD, because dyslexia fits into so many different categories, and we talk about that a lot on the show with other people around how it's actually diagnosed and the different labels that come out of it, and that it's been really hard to get a specific label for dyslexia. Yes,
you are right, because of the neurological aspect of dyslexia, it affects so many regions of the brain, the frontal lobe, the cerebellum. Now they're looking at the hippocampus and saying, well, there's an area in there that is also affecting dyslexia, people with dyslexia, which brings us back to dyslexia might be a broad term or a syndrome, not unlike the autistic spectrum syndrome. Dyslexia might be the syndrome, yet we have a number of difficulties that arise out of that syndrome because of the neurological relationship to the brain and the way the brain works in people who have dyslexia.
Well, I talk about that a lot in my doctorate, that, it is a spectrum in that it affects people differently, and that depending on how you are going during your day, it affects you. Some days is better than others. And it is a spectrum in that some people have higher functioning literacy skills versus other people, depending on how much intervention and how far you've got through your education system, and how your teachers, how much intervention they've been taught, like you were saying, around CPD skills, and how much they've learnt about dyslexia and how they're able to support students in the classroom.
Yes. And I think primary school teachers find it quite challenging because they've got a lot of littlies who've got lots of difficulties, and then, they're trying to implement various strategies for all of these little children, and it is difficult. In the United Kingdom, as you know, there's the Red Rose School, and that's a school specifically for people or children who have dyslexia. And the children can go right through in that school and then go to university from there. Whereas in Australia, as you know, there's not that facility, and I don't think that we're going to get something like that soon, because it certainly doesn't seem to be on the agenda of most of the, not only government but even private institutions. They don't recognise dyslexia as we do, and I think they find it quite challenging. They don't know what to do if they have somebody who has dyslexia in the workplace. They think, oh, right, this person has reading difficulties, maybe we can't employ them. But that's certainly not the case, as you're well aware.
No, I think they don't even know what the word actually means, let alone then how to support or manage that staff member.
Yes.
So
I tend to agree.
You were diagnosed with dyslexia yourself, Jackie?
Yes, I was. I was diagnosed. It was quite funny. I was struggling in my master's level at university, and there was so much writing of educational assignments, whereas with my science degree it was very practical. You did the methods, the methodology, and you handed in your assignment. It was a very practical science program, whereas when I went into education, I had great difficulty with the organisation of my assignments and the writing of my assignments. And when I look back, I used to put the beginning of my assignments in the last paragraph and the first paragraph and the last paragraph at the beginning. I knew what the end was and I was writing it first. But after having to repeat a subject which was socially focused, I decided I needed to get assessed. I had been working with a Dr John Worthington here in Queensland in a TAFE sector, and he used to come in and assess all of the students who had various disabilities. So I contacted him and I asked him would he do a diagnosis on myself. And of course at that time dyslexia was not a recognised disability in Queensland, and he told me I had a phonological impairment and I'd had it from birth. But I seemed to progress through because I went through the old schooling system where it was direct teaching direct learning, and you learnt by the rote system in the early years. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and of course I have difficulties with my writing, and I certainly take much longer to read than most. And it's quite funny. Throughout my PhD, I was asked to read books and this, that and the other. And if you know a lot about reading, I had to buy the books because I had to underline the important words and write in the column so I would know where that section was. I couldn't borrow books from the library. I had to buy them. So it was a very expensive degree for me. But anyway, at the end I got through. So basically my diagnosis really saved me because I was struggling and floundering with the writing. And once I then knew I had to put some strategies in place. And of course I did buy one particular book that I use for myself, and now that Sandra has written a book with John Crabb, I utilise that book as well. So, you know, they're very good books, and I couldn't have been without them to progress through my PhD.
And so how did you feel when you were diagnosed?
Well, I was relieved. I was very relieved because I had been struggling with my writing. I had been struggling with my, not my reading, but more my writing and my ability to succinctly explain myself. So I felt very, very relieved once I had been diagnosed, because then I knew I could get some help.
And is there anyone else in your family? Because in my family we've got 3 generations. Do you think there's anyone else?
No, there's no one else in my family. So, yes, so it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because there is a familial link. And there is, as you know, there's a genetic link to dyslexia. That they have found a number of genetic areas that are linked to reading and writing and whatever in families. So it goes down to other generations, but no, not with me.
Interesting. And so your PhD has been all focused on young people and adults in TAFE and university?
No, mine is only focused on TAFE because it was quite difficult to get access to students at the university. A lot didn't want to disclose. A lot goes through university and never tell anyone and have support on the side and pay for it. But I had worked previously in TAFE, so I knew a lot of the disability officers and I knew some of the managers. So I was certainly able to access my participants, but I couldn't access them because of privacy. The disability officer in each of the 5 campuses where I interviewed students, they had to access the participants for me because of the privacy issues and the legislation around disability with giving out people's names and so on and so forth. So
what? Sorry. What supports and strategies did you put in place? You mentioned Sandra Hardgraves and Jamie Crabb's study skills for students with specific learning difficulties textbook, which we've spoken about on other podcasts before, and their books on our website, and it is an amazing resource for students at TAFE and university. Were there other things you put in place that helped you get through?
Well, I used another textbook which is now out of print. It's called Dyslexia and Learning Style by Tilly Mortimer. And of course, it came out just a couple of years before I started my research role, and I had bought it because that was out when I was working in TAFE. So I used to look at the strategies used by Mortimer and I'd implement them for the students, or I'd tell the teachers this is what you should be doing, or, so on. So basically that's, I used that. But my main strategies were doing qualitative research. I did it all manually. I didn't use any technology because I'm not technology savvy, except for the use of Dragon, which I use continually. I used mind mapping. I planned my chapters, so I'd put sections in there to make it look clear and concise. I wrote notes in mapping books. All the transcripts that came back to me that were professionally transcribed, my audio tapes were professionally transcribed, they were all put into mapping books under the themes.
That's a good idea, professionally transcribing rather than hand doing it yourself.
Yes, and I cut up all the quotes that all fitted under each and every one of my themes, and that's how I did my codes. And I have about 8 huge big mapping books full of codes. But anyway, then I wrote all of my literature. So each piece of literature I read, I did a little synopsis of it so that I could go back to it and specific things I could go into, and I knew where to go and what to look for. Even the theses, I did that for, and I'd do it for each chapter. Then I used Google terms and reviewed Wikipedia before searching through the databases for appropriate journals. When you're doing your PhD, you often find there are terms that you don't understand. So what I did, I looked at those terms on Wikipedia, got the basis of it, and then went to the journal articles for further explanation, and I found that very helpful. And a lot of people don't use it, but I use it for the grounded knowledge, just the basic knowledge, and then I go and find out relevant journals. As I said, I purchased many textbooks that were related to both the historical and recent advancement of dyslexia, and I'd write notes on the sides of all of my textbooks. I spoke with academics and other PhD students studying similar topics. One thing, I had a great rapport with a number of academics. I had made a friend with Dr Robin LeBrock, who was a sociologist at UQ in the medical faculty, and she, Mark Keogh, Cass Tanner, all helped me. They didn't help me with any writing or whatever, but now and then they'd send me a paper and say, how about reading that? That might add to your literature, or what about this, or, and I used Cass Tanner's PhD right throughout my thesis because she was one of the first in Australia to study dyslexia. The next thing I did was I wrote chapters and then I cut them out and glued them in place in mapping books, as I had said, so that it was well organised. I didn't have sections going hither-thither. The most important things to me throughout my PhD was the glue, the large mapping books, coloured pens, computer notes and literature notes, and my friends. And the specific technology was Dragon Naturally Speaking. However, I only use this when I'm writing papers now. I don't need it for quick emails or anything, but I found that the monotone of it became so automated. I didn't like using it as a reading tool. I just take my time now because I have got time. I take my time reading it and underlining and taking notes if I've got to read any journals, which is quite regularly. But, yeah, so...
There is one piece of technology, though, that you did recommend to me, which is Grammarly, which I've been using now, which has been fantastic.
Grammarly is excellent. Grammarly I got onto when I was reading my, writing my last piece of thesis, and it just helped me with my grammar so much. And of course, we in Australia use the English version of Grammarly, not the American version. So in Queensland, we all use the English version of Grammarly. So sometimes you have to override it, even though you set it for British. Sometimes have to override it because there's, particularly when it says organised, we go I-S-E-D, whereas they go I-Z-E-D. But no.
Likes to hyphenate everything as well, I've noticed.
Yeah. But, it's a great tool, and I use it all the time.
And an amazing achievement, Jackie, to have completed your PhD. And for all our listeners out there that are wanting to complete their PhD, some amazing strategies that helped Jackie and a lot of tips for me as I try to struggle through doing my doctorate at the moment. So thank you, Jackie. But we've also talked a lot about all the advocacy work that you're doing up in Queensland. Like all states across Australia, there's a shift that's starting to occur across the country in trying to address what's happening to people with dyslexia, not just in schools, but at each level across education and in the workplace. The movement is occurring and we are trying to make change. So you've been advocating and you're trying to make changes up there. So what are some of the steps you're trying to put in place so that you can see some change happening up there? And what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would like to see, well, put it this way, in Australia we have this perception that we like things to be funded. Like when students come to me or mothers ring up or families ring up about their children, they say to me, is this a Medibank funded system? And I said, well, no. I said, unfortunately, in Australia, there is no educational support that is funded. And to this day, I have tried through members of Parliament, the Health Minister, to get some form of funding for people with communication difficulties like dyslexia, speech and language, a range of communication difficulties. And I said to them, this isn't good enough because there's a lot of people who can't get work, who definitely cannot read and write, and they're the ones who haven't got the money to put in place to come to me. Even though my services are very cheap compared to others in Australia, even still, my clients are the people unvoiced and without money. So I've tried every which way to get some funding to help my clients, but at this stage nothing is happening. However, I always look back at a friend of mine who I've mentioned in the program. She started out, Dr Robin LeBrock, started out as a tutor, and then she wasn't a tutor. She was a mentor and advocate. And through her friendship and the relationship we had, I completed my PhD. And she would, every turn, she would give me advice on what to do, as well as tutoring me. So I find that tutoring comes in many forms. I have to charge to keep my business open, as you could agree, Shay. Mm-hmm. But I believe I always give extra time. So it says, $60 an hour. But they can have 3 hours of tutoring if they book at $50. They can have that for $50 an hour if they book 3 hours. And then I always give them a little bit more time. Like today I was with a girl half an hour more. Well, that's in the hour. You know, I include that. I'm not mean with the support I provide, and I always try and give them a little bit more, because I often look back at Robin and how she helped me. And it wasn't just the tutoring. It was she'd give me specific feedback, and she'd ask questions when I went into the, if you go and do the review section in your Word document, like track changes and things, she'd put things in the column and say, have you read that? Or where did you read it? I mightn't have put a reference in. Or it might have been a bit out of date. So she asked questions like that. It wasn't just she gave me the answer. Mm. She supported my learning, and through that she was the advocate, and we're still friends today, which is lovely. So, I think it's a case of the relationships that are built up through tutoring and through advocacy are those that can be lifelong. And that's what I'm trying to do with my clients, not just to come to tutoring for money's sake, but to come form a relationship. I've offered one particular client that I would go out to the interview with her. Now that's, I don't have to do that, but that's what I call advocacy, to give her a bit of support in her interview and make sure she's feeling confident before she goes out. And I don't charge for that. I charge for it. But I see that as part of my role as a tutor.
That's amazing, because it is really hard, because, technically a child won't get any funding unless they're 2 standard deviations. Well, it used to be, unless it's changed, but when I was a speech, it was 2 standard deviations from the norm. It might be 1 now, I can't remember, but, so a child can't get any funding. And if you're dyslexic, you need continuous intervention to help you get your literacy skills up to the standard of a child that's, their grade. We're normally 2 academic year levels behind, but that's not enough to qualify for any type of funding. So you're always going to be behind, and a parent can't afford to consistently be paying money for a speech pathologist or a literacy tutor to keep them at the level they need to be at. So they're always going to be behind in their academic level. And so it's extremely unfortunate, and they're always going to be at a disadvantage. And so how do you ever get people to be on an even playing field, or children that then become adults to be on an even playing field with the norm as such? So it's extremely frustrating.
Well, actually, that's what I found in my research, Shay, and I had adults who had gone to TAFE for the first time, and they were 34, 35, 40, because they couldn't write well or had literacy problems, and they'd been to literacy classes and those classes hadn't benefited the students. So they enrolled in TAFE, and they've done different things like Certificate 1 and then Certificate 2 and Certificate 3, and would progress up the ladder, and now some of them were completing their diplomas. But it was a case of learning at a slower pace, and the teachers gave them additional time, and they'd helped them throughout the program at Certificate 1 and Certificate 2, and these were adults who'd never, ever gained a qualification, let alone a high school completion. So, they were doing particularly well, I thought, and we don't want that to continually happen in Australia, not when we see Britain leaps and bounds ahead of us in supporting people with dyslexia. We need to be on that pathway and get to that pathway so we can actually support our students at school and people in tertiary environments.
That's right. Well, Jacque, if there's some advice that you could give young people and adults out there that might be listening to this podcast, what are some take-home messages that you'd like them to hear, considering all the amazing achievements that you have achieved over the last few years, particularly now finishing your PhD?
Well, Shay, it's interesting, but I think the most important thing when you go into a tertiary environment is to disclose your disability and ask for support and ask for appropriate support. And if that support isn't provided, because you, a learner, will know exactly what you need to help you, and that might change as you progress in learning. So don't be frightened to go back to the disability officer and say, I need this for my disability, and my needs have changed, because they do change. The higher you go in the course advancement, the more needs you may require, and the more support you will require. So always disclose and go back to your disability officer. But if nobody listens to you at your TAFE or university, go further. Go to the manager, because unless you get appropriate support for your disability needs, you're either going to fail, like many of my participants told me. In schools they failed because nobody listened to them and nobody gave them the support. So if you have a manager of equity, go to them, be persistent with your learning and do not give up. You will gain your qualification if you are persistent. And if you use some of those strategies that I've spoken about today, they will certainly help you. They might seem time-consuming, which they are, but they do work if you use them all the time for every subject that you're doing. I always say persistence is what got me there, but I also recommend some outside tutoring for dyslexia. So don't go to just a tutor if you're having challenges. Go to a tutor who has experience with people who have dyslexia, because you will find that it is probably the reading and writing strategies and and the structures that are not in place are the things that you need. And if you go to the dyslexia tutors, they will be able to put those strategies in place.
And so where would someone find one, Jackie? Because we haven't had many on the show, and we haven't had many places to go to recommend on the show where people could go and source a dyslexic tutor. So is it mainly through the spelled associations that someone would go?
Yes, I would go to spelled initially. And then if you don't go to spelled, often there are people like me who have online tutoring, but I would, because I don't know the legislation around there, and I'm very familiar with what's happening in Queensland, I would really try and get onto spelled. Their specialised tutors are a little more expensive than I am, but they're worth their weight in gold. And I think you'll find that they will really give you some clear strategies to put in place for your learning. If not, you can call me online. As you know, Shay has my number, my email address and my website. But if you can't get something down there, I'm more than happy to tutor you online. And I think Shay's got something in place for that, have you, Shay? But anyway, we'll talk about Shay and I'll talk about that after. I'm more than happy to do something for you.
So have you put any of your strategies into fact sheets or anything, Jackie, that we could put online that's come out of your PhD?
No, I don't. Now, the reason I don't is because I haven't got around to it yet.
Okay.
I'm hoping to put out a small book in the next few months, and I'm going to ask people like Sandra to help, and I might even ask you, Shay, to do some work with me on this book, and we'll put out a small textbook for students particularly, so they can resource it here in Australia. It's small, it's not too wordy, and it'll be able to be sold at universities for people with learning difficulties and dyslexia.
Well, for all of our listeners out there, we are looking at developing some resources. There are some resources already on the Dear Dyslexic website for tips for students at TAFE and university. We just launched that this year, but also for lecturers and at TAFE and university as well. There's tips for them on how to support students, particularly through exam time and with assignments and different things like that. So there are tip sheets and fact sheets on the website, plus some resource and textbooks as well. And then we can also look at what Jackie's thinking about to help her developing some stuff. And we're also looking at developing some training courses with Jackie and Sandra. We've got a working group at the moment together to look at how we can better support people at TAFE and university so they can help us dyslexics that are studying out there. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Jackie, before we wrap up our conversation today?
No, Shay. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. If you'd like to hear more about all the great work Jackie's doing on the Sunshine Coast, you can go to the Dear Dyslexic website at deardyslexic.com. Also, if you haven't already done so yet, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with all the work that we are doing at the Foundation. Head to deardyslexic.com. And don't forget, if there's anything you've heard today that you've found distressing, you can contact Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline 13 11 14. Thanks for listening, and until next time, bye for now.